What's up, folks? Jason here, Gonzo from Maniac Racing on R7. And what we're going to do today is we're going to go and put together, we're doing some pistons and rods. We're building a motor for a turbo. And it's been a block down rebuild. So we've got a block that's all cleaned up and machined, and it's ready to go. And we've got some powder rods that are going in to the turbo, and a set of Wasner pistons. They're just a 20cc bowl. Pretty traditional standard compression piston. So I have three of the piston and rod assemblies already put together and completed, and I'm going to go ahead and we're going to start with the rings. I'm going to show you how to gap the rings, and if they need to be adjusted, we'll take care of that. And then we're going to assemble this piston and rod, connecting rod setup, and then I'm going to go ahead and get everything into the block, and we'll drop the last one in there so that you can be there for that too. Alright, so I'm going to start real quick with what I have here to use for this project, and then I'll get myself cleaned up and ready to go on the next one, and we'll come back to the video. So before we get started, I have obviously a set of pistons and a set of rods. Everything was ordered specifically for this car, so you know, I feel good that they're the right parts for the application. Wrist pins, they're new in the package. These are the retaining clips for the wrist pin that hold the rod in the piston, so that passes through there, and those retaining clips are going to lock in there. There's a trick to them, so we're going to go over those. Obviously I have a set of rings. Okay, I have a little bit of Lucas assembly lube. I prefer Lucas. I'm a fan of Lucas, pretty much all of their different lubricants. But for engine building, specifically in the 944 environment, this is a great product because it does contain zinc and moly. So it keeps everything pretty slick for the startup and for the build process, but the zinc is really good for aluminum blocks. I have over here, this is a little bit a blend of ATF and the motor oil that I intend to use in the car. That's for cleaning and for a little bit of lubrication for when I'm trying to get parts to go together. I have a couple of very simple tools. Okay, really to do all of this work, all I need is a couple of picks, and I'll show you when I use them. And I have a feeler gauge. Alright, my feeler gauge is open. You can't see it on the camera, but it's set to .015 and .025 because I have the specs here for the piston ring. And you know, skirt clearance, we're already good with that. We had the all the bores mic'd, and then the pistons ordered for this, and then importantly the recommended ring end gap. So the top two rings are both 0.15 inches, and the oiling ring is 0.25. So we're going to get that. We're going to get those set up. All right. The only specialty tool that I have that you may or may not have is an old piston. Okay, because when we put the piston rings in for measurement, I prefer to not use the brand new pistons that are $1,000 and get them all scored up and marked up by dipping them in and out of the cylinder bore. So I'm going to use an old piston to square up the ring in the bore when we're going to check it for gap. Alright, so you'll see that come into play. If not, you can use your existing piston, or you can use your new piston, and we'll just give you some care and handling. So let me get ready to do the rings, and then we'll come back to video. Alright, we're back, and I've got my piston rings out, and I've assembled just basically the tools I'm going to use for getting these set up. Now I've already done the first three cylinders, so I kind of have an expectation of what I'm going to run into. And on the first three, the oiling rings were a little bit closer than we needed to, so I also set up a filer, and I'll show you that in a second. So this is a ring set, standard ring set for the 944 turbo. Okay, this is a 3-piece oiling ring. Sometimes you'll have a 2-piece oiling ring where the retainer is one piece. Sometimes you'll have, I've seen a 4-piece ring, but this has an inner spring on a wire, and then it has an inside and outside retainer or scraper that's going to be on the outside. This is what we're going to gap. Okay, we're going to gap those to .025. This is the middle ring, and the smallest one is on the top. These are the two different scraping rings. And you'll see they're chamfered and beveled a little bit differently, per your order in your car, but you should be able to work it out. Something to note: the scrapers, in this case, both have some writing on the top. I don't know if you're going to be able to get clear enough on the video, but you can see it. So we have some writing. That's really important that it goes in that side up. Okay. I'm going to start by getting the block ready, the bore that we're going to be doing. So I have this motor tilted towards me so that I can work with it on the chair. But you can orient it any way that you're comfortable. I'm going to take a little bit of assembly lube. I'm going to make a smiley face around the cylinder bore like that. Now I'm just going to take my finger. I'm just going to smear it in there. For this part of the job where we're gapping these rings, we're only going to be going into the cylinder about an inch. So I don't need to get it all gummed up yet. We're not setting the piston at this point. Okay? So now that I have that set, I'm going to start with on the bottom, right, with the oiling rings. And I'm going to take them, and I'm just going to take a little bit of that ATF/oil mixture, kind of wipe it off, put it on, and squeeze it off with my fingers. All right, and now I'm going to set this into the bore. Very simple. I do the same thing all the time. All right, I start with one side. Now the oil rings are very light, and it isn't a big deal. Okay, and then push it in there with my finger. Now I'm going to take this piston, and I'm going to use it. I'm going to put my thumb, one thumb on each of the skirts. I'm going to put the piston in to the cylinder bore upside down until my thumbs are flush. Okay? That way, that ring is seated inside of that cylinder nice and square. Alright, now with my feeler gauge, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to try and put this feeler gauge inside of that gap. Like I expected, this is a little bit tight. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this out, and I'm going to come over here to my rig. I just have a Dremel, regular Dremel, set on the lowest speed with a grinding wheel. Okay, it's a brittle grinding wheel. It's got material on both sides. I have a flex attachment, and it's in a little small helping hands vise. Okay, that way, because I want this to spin, I have it set at the lowest speed, and I'm going to take the ring, and I'm just going to butt the ring up like this on each side and pinch it, and try and just get a nice square, very smooth cut, because I only have to take off a couple mils, so it's not like a lot of material. So we're going to turn that on nice and low. Okay, I have a lot of oil and lubricant on this, so I'm not worried about trying to sand this dry. Okay, and all I'm going to do is I'm just going to make little touches like this. I'm kind of pinching the ring together. Alright, I'm holding it pretty close because the rings are brittle. I don't want them to bend or break. I just want to take a little shot off of each side. I'm going to flip it over so I don't get an uneven edge. Okay, now it's nice to use a two-sided wheel, because then when I close the ring, if I push it shut, it has a nice flat gap. There's no space in there. There's no point or outside edges. So I'm going to drop this back in the bore. Square it up with the piston. Try it with my feeler. And I'm there. Alright, so I'm going to repeat this process with the other oiling ring, the other scraper for the oiling ring. Same. So I'm going to take just a little bit off. Now these are only taking me 45 seconds, but the first one took 45 minutes to figure out how much material I had to take off, make sure I had everything right, and like I said before, to kind of get myself ready from an expectation standpoint so that the rest of the job can go quickly. Still a little fat. Be really careful. All the edges on the pistons are super sharp. These are all CNC machined, usually out of some kind of forged billet, and they're really sharp, so they'll dice you up a little bit. Alright, now I got a little bit of breathing room there. I'm going to repeat the process with the other two rings. On the first three cylinders, I did not have to adjust the gap. The end gap was good on these. Okay, now per my spec sheet, these are a .015. Now this is kind of a little bit different than the oiling rings. The oiling rings are much smaller and much softer. Okay, so there's a lot less firmness to them. These guys are very brittle if they're not bent in the direction they're supposed to. They're high carbon, they're spring steel, they want to be open. So what I do is I put the top in, right, I'm just comfortable working that way, okay, and then I kind of push from the top and I just work it in with my thumb. All I want to do is clear the top of that cylinder bore, that's it. I don't care how it's seated because I'm going to take it and square it up with my piston. Okay, now that's nice and square and straight. Okay, these are 015s, so just adjust, get the correct blade on my feeler, and like the other three, this one was good, so we're going to do the last oil ring, number one, the top ring, same thing, a little bit of ATF motor oil, just make sure that we're not scraping up the edge of that cylinder bore. We're going to do the same thing. Put the top in, work it in with my thumb while I hold it in place. Whoops. Set it square with the piston. Feeler gauge. Good to go. Alright, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to wipe my hands a little bit. I'm going to get out the piston, the connecting rod, wrist pin, clips. We're going to put together the connecting rod to the piston assembly, and then we're going to seat all these rings, alright? Be back in 30 seconds. Alright, so here we go. We got these nice Wasmer pistons. I want to show you on the top, there's a small arrow. That indicates the front of the motor, okay? So it's important for when we do our orientation, okay? So I'm putting that on the bottom. There's a notch over here. I don't know what it's specifically for, but I know that if the arrow faces forward, this is the back of the piston, okay? And then I know also that I'm going to use that as a guideline for orienting my connecting rod. The connecting rod, if I pull the cap off, you'll see it has a side on each end of it that has a little nipple there, or a tip for for the rod bearings, okay? There's a little bung on the rod bearings that clicks into there and locks, all right? These both go on the same side. They're oriented like that, and I'm just going to bump them together so they don't fall apart while we're doing our assembly. And on these particular rods, it says 944 on one side, and then it has a rod identifier so that you can make sure you match up the right cap with rod for each of the 4 different rods. So the rod bearing little clips, factory orientation puts them on the same side of the motor as the oil cooler, which is facing down in our case, right? So if I'm using this as my guide, my piston is going to be seated in here, facing forward, okay? And I need alright, so put it like that. And I need the oiling tabs, or the locking tabs rather, for the rod bearings to be facing this side of the block, okay? I want the 944, in my case, up. So depending on the type of pistons and rods you're using, you're going to have different identifying marks. The important thing is that you get the orientation correct and accurate, all right, and that you do this all 4 times. You don't want to put one of your pistons in backwards or your rods on backwards. Okay. So the other things that is important to see and note on a piston, okay, obviously you have your 3 rings, I guess they're the channels or the grooves for the rings. The largest one, which is the thickest, is for the oil ring set. All right, it's going to get the spring in the middle, and then it's going to have one of the scrapers on each side. The center ring is the first scraper. It's the widest, but it is also the thinnest. And then the top ring has a chamfer or a bevel on the inside edge. It's the final scraper. It's narrower than the second, but it's a little bit thicker. Okay, that's to accommodate for any movement that the piston makes like this. That sets it up like this. The oiling ring exudes the oil. The first scraper picks up the majority of it. The second scraper has just a few mils worth of play so that it doesn't destroy the inside of the cylinder board when it moves. Okay, the wrist pin slot like this. The wrist pin is going to go in through. Okay, it's going to lock the small ring on the connecting rod. All right, and it's going to be held by these C-clips. So the first thing I want to pay attention to is the C-clips, because it's a pain in the tail if you don't know. There are spiral locks. There are a flat C-clip. These are the original. It's the wire lock. Never ever had a problem with one. I prefer them. I hated them violently until I figured out how to put them in properly, and it was so simple. I then hated myself because for all the torment and the rings flying across the room and being shot in the eye and the face. I should have my safety glasses on. I'll go ahead and do that since who knows who's watching. But in any case, the whole trick with this, and it's so painfully simple, is you just do this. You put a little twist on it. If you're righty or lefty, it doesn't matter which way. Okay, just a little bit. You can see how that's no longer flat. All right, now I'm going to take and I'm going to start in the front of the piston. Okay, so my arrow's this way. I'm going to start in the front because the back is the entry point for the wrist pin. Now there's a little notch that's for removing the clip. So I don't want my clip to start at that notch. I just want it to be near it. I'm going to take the part that I bent down and I'm going to stick it in that groove. I'm going to pull it back with my finger, and I'm just going to force this ring up in with my thumb. That's it. And then to make it seat, I use the back side of a hook. I don't want to use something sharp, and I just push it down just a little bit. Whoops. And it will clip. You will hear it click into place. There it goes. Okay, so that's in there. It's seated nice and tight. Now I'm going to flip the piston over. All right, so I'm working from the top. Take my wrist pin out of the package. It's clean. I'm going to take some assembly lube, and I'm going to coat this particular piece pretty liberally. Okay, I really want this to be fully lubed. This is the bearing, and it's going to be moving all the time. I don't want any dryness on this before the motor starts oiling it. Okay, we're going to do that. I am going to take and put a drop in each of the races on the piston. And I'm going to put some inside of the small opening on the rod where that wrist pin's going through. Okay, now getting this guy started, it's one of those little tricks. I just dip the very tip of it into my ATF oil mixture and just try and find that straight up and down. And there it goes. Okay, as soon as it starts going in, I'm going to put my piston, my rod in there, and I get that wrist pin seated on the rod, and push it all the way through. Boom! It'll hit that connecting ring or the retaining ring that we put in before. I'm going to do the same thing. Put a nice little bend on this guy. Okay, and I'm going to get him started on that side. And just push them in with my finger. There he goes. And just seat him with the back side of that pick. Boom. Clipped in. Okay, so my rod and piston are now connected. Alright, with my wrist pin. So before you were here when I was gapping the rings, alright, all I did was stack them in the order that they're going to go in. I'm starting in the oiling channel. Okay, and again, assembly lube. I'm just going to make a line right over each one of those grooves. I'm going to push it in with my finger. I want plenty of oil in there. Okay, flip the piston over. Do the same side. Do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so with the oil, we start with the oiling ring. Alright, first the spring ring, and whether it's a regular traditional coil spring or something like what we're working with, it's going to have a piece of wire in the middle that holds it apart and is a guide. Okay, I'm going to open that up, and I'm going to pop this right up into that channel. Okay, I'm going to make sure it goes in there nice. Now, you have each one of these rings, including the spring, has a gap. Okay, now there's something very important. It's called clocking the rings. All right, when these rings go in your motor, you don't want the gaps to look like this, because then as the piston comes up, there's a nice little path of no resistance for compression gases to escape through, so you can come up with a compression and or oiling problem. So what we're going to do is we're going to clock them. Okay, the two scrapers go 180 to each other. The oil scrapers go 180 to each other. Okay, and then the gap on the spring, the piston has oiling holes on both sides. What I do is I just don't put it on the oiling holes. Okay, I go about 120 degrees off. All right, so it's off center. All right, now I'm going to start with the lower scraper. Okay, and all I do is I seat the very first part, and now I'm going to walk it around the piston by kind of holding it open, and I'm going to make sure it's in there nice, which it is. Okay, top one, putting the gap someplace else. Okay, 180 off of this one. So over here, doing the same thing, getting it started in the channel, walking it around, kind of twisting it on. Okay, you don't want to pull on these rings very hard in any direction. They are all brittle. Okay, they will break. Alright, so my oil ring is all set up. Got my gaps about 180 off each other. Feeling comfortable with them. Okay, now I'm going with the big ring. keep in mind these have writing on them to denote the top. Okay, I use my wrist pins as guides for these. So this one, actually got to flip over. Okay, I want this particular ring facing the back of the motor, so I just flip the piston so it's front down, and I'm going to put my gap right here. Alright, same thing. Now what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to start just a little tip, okay, and now I'm going to give it a little twist. I'm kind of pushing down and letting that ring seat, and I'm only using my fingers. There are tools for this, but I don't like them. I don't want to scratch that piston surface, and you see it went right in there. That assembly lube is nice, keeps everything moving, keeps it, and it's a little sticky, so but it does hold everything together. Alright, so now I've got my first scraper in, so I'm going to put, or my second scraper, basically the middle ring. I'm going to put the top scraper in now. So I flip it over, again, make sure top up orientation, get my gap on the wrist pin, and just hold it open with my finger, and boom, right in. Okay, so my piston is put together right now. I'm just going to wrap it in paper to keep it clean. Now I gap these rings per cylinder bore, so I'm putting them back in the box. I just marked what order is which. So I'm going to put a couple of these, I'm going to put these pistons into the block, and I'm going to save the last one, and we'll come back in and we'll drop one into the block with you, alright? See you in a minute. Alright, we got 1, 2, and 3 all done. Our arrows are all facing the same way. We checked the clocking on the rings before we snapped them into the bore, and you notice that I had my motor tilted down before. Now it's straight. It's facing straight up and down. That's important for when you're setting the piston in. Okay, I'm going to take this assembly lube. I'm going to line the inside of the cylinder bore. Give it a nice bead straight across. I'm going to take my finger and I'm just going to goop that in there. All right, I want basically about the top quarter to half of the cylinder done right now. When we put the crank in later, we're going to hit the rest of it. So that's going to be good for now. Now I'm going to get my piston and rod assembly, okay, that I have gapped for number 4. I'm going to take a little bit of my ATF. I'm just going to kind of smear it on. I still have assembly lube left from when I put the rings in. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of seat that up. Now, something very important. Okay, we're going to go into a cylinder bore that's freshly machined, and we've been doing a real, we've been paying real careful attention to keep it clean and smooth. We don't want any imperfections or anything that's going to break up the compression. So these are super sharp. Okay, I mentioned it before, all the piston surfaces and the rod surfaces. These are sharp and rough. So what I do is I take one of the oily rags that I've been using, and I just kind of stuff it in there. All right, make a little hat for the bottom of it. All right, now we're going to drop it into the cylinder bore. Okay, now I'm just going to lower it in, and I am going to, once the skirt is in there, I'm just going to kind of hold it up for a second, and I'm going to check the clock positions. All right, so I have my top one on the wrist pin in the front, my bottom one on the wrist pin, or my middle on the wrist pin in the back. Here's the paint mark, which indicates where the oil ring gap is. I'm just going to move that over a little bit. It's a little close to what I like it. Okay, I have a gap over here on the lower ring at 180 from that. I'm good. Okay, so I like my clocking. Now I'm just going to let the piston sit for a second. Okay, it's going to obviously stop at the rings. We're going to get our compressor. Okay, I have a pretty standard band style compressor. It's got a locking clip on the top. Make sure that's on the top. Before you put this in, release the spring. Okay, it will open up because you want it to be, well larger than the piston. You don't want to put any pressure on the ring. Now what I do is I do kind of a two-step, because a lot of times I do this by myself. Right now I have Paul here to help, which is awesome, but in the event that you are by yourself, okay, I get it so it's touching. It's not tight, it's touching. If anything, that might even be a little tight. All right, I just want it to be able to touch. Now I'm going to pop this up, this piston, just a little bit, all right, and then I'm going to put a twist on it, okay, until the ring compressor holds the piston up, which it's doing. Now I want to make sure it's square, and I want to get it nice and tight. All right, it's good. Rubber mallet, wooden handle. You could use any hammer, just make sure it has a rubber or a wooden handle. And I'm just going to pop the center down, and the spring will just pop off when the piston's seated. So now I've got all 4 pistons in my 944 turbo motor seated in place, rods on, everything's in the right orientation. I checked all my rings, I'm feeling good. We're going to put the main bearings in and crank, and we're going to have a basically assembled short block. So I'm looking forward to getting this motor together and checking back in with you guys in a little bit. I hope this helps. See you later.